Russia was no longer fighting on the battlefield. It was fighting for the mind. By 2020, the West was divided. America torn by politics. Europe divided over energy. And the world distracted by a pandemic. Putin saw the moment he'd been waiting for. And quietly, Russian troops began to gather near Ukraine's borders. Chapter 3. The Road to Invasion. December 2021. The world's attention was on the pandemic, politics and recovery. But in the frozen plains of Eastern Europe, something far more dangerous was brewing. Satellite images began to reveal the truth. Russia was building one of the largest military forces seen in Europe since World War II. Over 150,000 troops, columns of tanks, missile launchers, a slow, calculated encirclement. Moscow called it an exercise. The world called it a warning. But why? Why risk everything? Sanctions, isolation, war for Ukraine? Because to Putin, this was never about Ukraine alone. It was about power, the kind that reshapes borders and rewrites history. In his eyes, the West had grown weak, divided by politics, consumed by comfort, and blinded by its own belief in peace. Russia, he believed, was ready to act. The West was not. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies were watching. The CIA, MI6, European analysts. They saw the build-up. They issued warnings, but even then, few believed Putin would go all the way. Western leaders tried diplomacy, meetings in Geneva, calls to Moscow. Publicly, peace. Privately, panic. Because they understood something the public didn't. If Russia invaded Ukraine, it wouldn't just change one border. It could unravel the entire global order. Through the winter of 2021, the pressure grew. Ukrainians went about their daily lives, but anxiety was everywhere. In Kyiv, people stocked supplies. In Donbass, soldiers prepared for the worst. And in Moscow, Putin made his final moves. He surrounded himself with loyalists, men who shared his vision, his paranoia, his fear of Western expansion. They told him what he wanted to hear, that Ukraine would fall in days, that the people would welcome Russian troops, that the West would do nothing. And on February 21, 2022, Putin gave a speech that shocked the world. He denied Ukraine's right to exist as a nation. He called it a creation of Lenin, and he recognized the separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent republics, a signal the world understood as a prelude to war. The clock was ticking, and then came February 24th. At 4 a.m., the skies over Kyiv lit up. Cruise missiles struck airfields and military bases across Ukraine. Columns of tanks rolled in from the north, south, and east. Putin called it a special military operation. But the world called it what it was, an invasion. For Ukrainians, it was a nightmare come alive. Families woke to the sound of war. Mothers carried their children into subways. Fathers said goodbye, not knowing if they'd ever return. Within 24 hours, the world changed. Cities fell under siege. The global economy trembled. And humanity watched, again, as history repeated itself. But here's the truth few wanted to face. The invasion wasn't a sudden decision. It was years in the making. A product of broken promises, hidden ambitions, and a world that refused to see what was coming. Putin believed he was fighting to defend Russia's sphere of influence. But others saw something darker. A man chasing immortality, trying to carve his name into history books, no matter the cost. Inside Russia, propaganda exploded. State television called the war liberation. Protesters were arrested, independent media silenced. And in just weeks, the country that once longed for Western acceptance became isolated again, a fortress surrounded by enemies. But what about the West? NATO faced its greatest test since its creation. Would it defend Ukraine? Would it risk global war? The answer was complicated. Ukraine was not a NATO member. That meant no direct military defense. But money, weapons, and intelligence began to flow in. And suddenly, a smaller nation stood against one of the world's largest armies. What the world expected to last days turned into months, and then years. Because something happened that Putin never anticipated, Ukraine didn't break. It fought back, harder than anyone imagined. From the streets of Kyiv to the fields of Kherson, Ordinary people became heroes, and the world began to see the war not as politics, but as a fight for survival. But behind the heroism lies the deeper question. Who benefits from this war? Who gains from chaos? Because every war hides a shadow market of weapons, energy, and influence. And as soldiers died on the battlefield, powerful people profited in silence. So while the world wept for Ukraine, others counted dollars, barrels, and contracts. And that's the tragedy behind the tragedy. War always has winners, just not the ones on the front line. Music slows. A dark screen with a single sentence fades in. On-screen text, every war begins with lies and ends with truth. The invasion was only the beginning. The real battle was for the world's future, for the control of energy, economy, and truth itself. Chapter 4: The Hidden Agendas. When the first missiles struck Ukraine, the world reacted with outrage. Governments condemned, corporations withdrew, and social media filled with flags, slogans, and solidarity. But behind the noise and outrage, a far more complex war was taking place, a war not of bombs, but of interests. Every modern conflict hides a web of motives, some visible, some buried deep beneath the surface. The Russia-Ukraine war was no exception. It wasn't just about territory or even security. It was about energy, economics, influence, and control, the invisible veins through which the lifeblood of global power flows. For decades, Europe's economy had been quietly tethered to Russia's energy. Nearly 40% of its natural gas came from Russian pipelines. Those pipelines were more than steel tubes. They were political weapons. Each cubic meter of gas was a reminder that Europe's comfort, its heat, its light, its industries, could be turned off with a single command from Moscow. When war broke out, those energy ties became chains. Western leaders promised sanctions, but they hesitated. Cutting off Russian oil and gas meant cutting off their own lifeline. For Putin, this was leverage, his economic nuclear weapon. For the West, it was the price of its own convenience. But there was another layer, one most people never saw. The world's military-industrial complex roared to life. Weapons contracts surged. Defense budgets ballooned. The same nations that spoke of peace were quietly selling the tools of war. For every image of devastation on the news, there were deals being signed behind closed doors. Missiles, drones, ammunition, intelligence systems. War, as history has proven again and again, is profitable. And this one was no different. As soldiers fought in the mud of Donbass, the world's stock markets trembled, energy prices soared, and powerful corporations watched their profits climb. Oil companies reported record earnings. Defense manufacturers posted their best quarters in decades. The longer the war lasted, the richer some became. But perhaps the most dangerous weapon of all was not a missile. It was information. In the 21st century, wars are not just fought on land or in the air. They are fought on screens. Every headline, every tweet, every video clip shapes perception, and perception shapes reality. Both sides understood this. Russia built an empire of propaganda. Western media, in response, crafted its own narrative. Truth became relative. Facts were filtered through ideology. And the average person scrolling through endless content became a soldier in a digital battlefield without even realizing it. Inside Russia, state television told citizens that they were fighting fascism, protecting their motherland, rescuing oppressed people. In the West, the story was about democracy versus tyranny, freedom versus oppression. Both stories contained truths, and both concealed lies. Because war, at its heart, is a struggle for narrative. Whoever controls the story controls the world's conscience. As the months dragged on, the real victims were not governments, but people. Millions of Ukrainians were displaced. Families fled their homes. Cities like Mariupol and Bakhmut became symbols of human endurance and human tragedy. Yet even as bodies were buried, politicians on all sides played their games of blame and calculation. There were whispers, too, about deeper motives about pipelines, contracts, and geopolitical chess. The Nord Stream pipelines, vital to Europe's energy network, mysteriously exploded beneath the Baltic Sea. No one took responsibility. Subscribe my channel for next part and next video will upload soon.